In the scorching heat of a military base in Afghanistan, Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez thought she was saving lives. She had no idea that her dedication to healing wounded soldiers would make her the target of a decorated general's twisted obsession. What started as small acts of intimidation escalated into something far more sinister. When 5 gunshots rang out across the medical tent on that fateful October evening, no one could have predicted that the investigation would uncover a web of corruption, abuse of power, and cover-ups that reached the highest levels of military command. This is the story of how one woman's courage to speak truth to power brought down a general who thought he was untouchable, and how justice prevailed even when the odds seemed impossible. But the path to that justice was paved with danger, betrayal, and revelations that shocked an entire nation. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on Forward Operating Base Thunder, a remote military outpost in Afghanistan's Kandahar province. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she carefully bandaged the shrapnel wounds of another young soldier. The makeshift medical tent buzzed with activity as wounded fighters were brought in from various missions across the volatile region. Maria had been deployed to Afghanistan for 8 months, serving as the head medic for the 3rd Infantry Division. At 28, she was already a veteran of 2 previous deployments, known for her quick thinking under pressure and her unwavering dedication to saving lives. Soldiers throughout the base respected her not just for her medical skills, but for her fearless attitude in the face of danger. What none of them knew was that Maria was facing a different kind of battle, one that had nothing to do with enemy combatants or roadside bombs. For the past 3 months, she had been the target of increasingly aggressive harassment from Brigadier General Richard Hawthorne, the commanding officer of the entire base. It had started innocently enough. General Hawthorne, a 45-year-old career military man with an impressive service record, had begun visiting the medical tent more frequently than necessary. At first, Maria assumed he was simply checking on the welfare of his troops, which seemed admirable. But gradually, his visits became more personal and inappropriate. The general would linger near Maria's station, making comments about her appearance that made her deeply uncomfortable. He would find excuses to touch her shoulder or hand while discussing patient care, ignoring her obvious discomfort. When Maria tried to maintain professional distance, Hawthorne's behavior became more aggressive and demanding. The situation escalated when Hawthorne began calling Maria to his office for what he claimed were medical consultations that had nothing to do with actual medical matters. During these meetings, he would make increasingly explicit suggestions about their relationship, despite Maria's clear rejections and reminders of military regulations regarding fraternization. Maria tried to handle the situation through proper channels. She reported Hawthorne's behavior to her immediate supervisor, Major James Patterson, hoping for support and intervention. However, Patterson seemed reluctant to take action against such a high-ranking officer. He suggested that Maria might be misinterpreting the general's intentions and advised her to handle it diplomatically. Frustrated but determined, Maria decided to document every inappropriate interaction with Hawthorne. She began keeping detailed notes of his visits, recording the dates, times, and exact nature of his inappropriate comments and advances. She also confided in her closest friend on the base, Corporal Lisa Chen, who worked in communications. Lisa was horrified by what Maria told her and encouraged her friend to take the matter higher up the chain of command. However, both women knew how difficult it would be to make accusations against such a powerful figure, especially in a male-dominated environment where questioning authority was discouraged. As weeks passed, Hawthorne's behavior became more brazen and threatening. He began making veiled threats about Maria's career prospects if she continued to reject his advances. He would make comments about how accidents happen in war zones, and how it would be unfortunate if Maria were to be transferred to a more dangerous posting. The psychological toll on Maria was enormous. She began having trouble sleeping, constantly looking over her shoulder, and second-guessing her every move. Despite her fear, she continued to perform her medical duties with the same dedication and professionalism that had earned her respect throughout the military. The breaking point came on a particularly violent day in early October. The base had received multiple casualties from an improvised explosive device attack on a convoy. Maria had been working non-stop for 14 hours, treating wounded soldiers and trying to save as many lives as possible. During this chaos, Hawthorne appeared in the medical tent and began demanding Maria's immediate attention for what he claimed was a minor injury to his hand. When Maria explained that she was dealing with critically wounded soldiers and suggested he wait or see another medic, Hawthorne exploded in anger. In front of numerous witnesses, the general began shouting at Maria, calling her insubordinate, and threatening to have her court-martialed for refusing a direct order. The incident was witnessed by several soldiers and medical staff, all of whom were shocked by Hawthorne's inappropriate outburst during such a critical medical emergency. That night, Maria made a decision that would change everything. She decided to formally file a complaint against General Hawthorne with the Inspector General's office, despite the risks to her career and personal safety. She spent hours carefully documenting every incident, gathering supporting evidence, and preparing a comprehensive report of Hawthorne's harassment and abuse of power. Lisa helped Maria prepare the complaint, and together they ensured that multiple copies were made and stored in secure locations. They both understood that taking on someone with Hawthorne's power and connections would be extremely dangerous, but Maria was determined to stop his behavior before he targeted other women on the base. The next morning, Maria submitted her formal complaint through encrypted military communications channels. The report detailed months of sexual harassment, abuse of authority, and threatening behavior. She included specific dates, times, locations, and witness names where possible. Within hours of submitting the complaint, Maria began noticing changes in her treatment on the base. Routine supply requests for the medical tent were suddenly delayed or denied. Her access to certain areas of the base was restricted without explanation. Most troubling of all, she noticed that her usual security escort for medical evacuations had been changed to soldiers she didn't know. Word of the complaint seemed to spread quickly through the base's informal communication networks, despite official protocols that should have kept such matters confidential. Maria found herself isolated from many colleagues who seemed afraid to be associated with someone who had dared to challenge such a powerful figure. General Hawthorne's behavior became even more erratic and threatening. He would appear unexpectedly wherever Maria was working, staring at her with obvious hostility. He began making loud comments about disloyal soldiers who bite the hand that feeds them whenever she was within earshot. The tension on the base became palpable as word of the investigation began to circulate. Soldiers were choosing sides, with some supporting Maria's courage and speaking out, while others remained loyal to the general who had led them through numerous successful missions. Maria's friend Lisa became increasingly worried about her safety. She had noticed that Hawthorne seemed to be keeping track of Maria's movements and schedules with unusual interest. Lisa began making sure she was never alone when possible, and suggested that Maria request immediate transfer to another base for her own protection. However, Maria refused to back down or flee. She believed that running away would not only damage her own career, but would send a message to other women in the military that powerful men could act with impunity. She was determined to see the investigation through, regardless of the personal cost. The situation reached a dangerous climax when Maria received an anonymous note warning her to withdraw her complaint or face serious consequences. The note was slipped under her door in the middle of the night, and its threatening tone made it clear that her life might be in danger. Despite the fear and pressure, Maria continued with her medical duties, treating wounded soldiers with the same dedication she had always shown. She refused to let Hawthorne's intimidation tactics compromise her commitment to saving lives. Even as the investigation into her complaint moved forward at what seemed like an incredibly slow pace. Unknown to Maria, her complaint had triggered a much larger investigation than she had anticipated. The Inspector General's office had received similar complaints about Hawthorne from other sources, and her detailed report had provided the evidence they needed to begin a comprehensive investigation into his conduct and command practices. As October progressed, the tension between Maria and Hawthorne continued to escalate. Their encounters became increasingly hostile, with the general barely maintaining the pretense of professional courtesy. Other officers on the base began to notice the obvious animosity between them, though most chose to stay out of what they saw as a dangerous situation. The investigation was being conducted with utmost secrecy, but its effects were beginning to be felt throughout the base's command structure. Several of Hawthorne's closest allies were quietly questioned about their knowledge of his behavior, and the general began to suspect that his position was under serious threat. On the evening of October 23rd, Maria was working late in the medical tent, updating patient records and preparing medical supplies for the next day's operations. The base was relatively quiet, with most soldiers either on duty or resting in their quarters. Lisa had offered to stay with her, but Maria had insisted that her friend get some rest after a long day. It was during this quiet evening that General Hawthorne made his final, desperate attempt to silence the woman who had dared to challenge his authority. What happened next would shock the entire military community and expose a level of corruption and abuse that reached far beyond one base in Afghanistan. The choices Maria had made in standing up to harassment and abuse of power were about to culminate in a confrontation that would change everything. Her courage in refusing to be silenced would soon be tested in the most terrifying way imaginable, setting in motion events that would ultimately bring justice, but at a cost she never could have anticipated. The medical tent was dimly lit by emergency lighting as Maria Rodriguez worked alone, organizing medical supplies and updating patient files from the day's casualties. It was nearly midnight on October 23rd, and the base had settled into the relative quiet of the night watch. The only sounds were the distant hum of generators and the occasional radio chatter from the guard posts. Maria was focused on her work, trying to keep her mind off the escalating tension with General Hawthorne and the slow progress of the investigation into her complaint. She had developed a routine of staying busy to avoid dwelling on her fears about what might happen to her career or her safety. The tent flap rustled, and Maria looked up expecting to see a wounded soldier or perhaps Lisa checking on her. Instead, General Hawthorne stepped into the medical area, his face flushed and his movements unsteady. The smell of alcohol was immediately apparent, and Maria realized with growing alarm that the general was heavily intoxicated. Hawthorne's eyes were bloodshot and filled with rage as he stared at Maria. His usually immaculate uniform was disheveled, and his speech was slurred when he finally spoke. "You think you're so smart, don't you, Rodriguez?" he said, swaying slightly as he moved deeper into the tent. "Filing your little reports, trying to destroy my career." Maria stood slowly, her training kicking in as she assessed the dangerous situation developing before her. "General, you shouldn't be here," she said firmly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Especially not in this condition. I think you should return to your quarters." Hawthorne laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and threatening in the confined space. "Don't you dare tell me what to do," he snarled. "I've been running this base and saving lives while you've been spreading lies about me. Do you have any idea what you've done?" The general began moving closer to Maria, his intentions clearly hostile. She backed away, calculating her options for escape, while trying to de-escalate the situation. "I've only reported the truth," she said carefully. "If you leave now, we can pretend this never happened." But Hawthorne was beyond reasoning. Months of investigation pressure, combined with alcohol and his growing realization that his career was in jeopardy, had pushed him over the edge.
He pulled out his sidearm, a standard-issue military pistol, and pointed it directly at Maria.
"You've destroyed everything," he said, his voice becoming more erratic. 25 years of service, and some little medic thinks she can bring me down with her lies." The weapon shook in his hand as his finger moved to the trigger. Maria's medical training had prepared her for many emergencies, but nothing could have prepared her for this moment. She raised her hands slowly, trying to appear non-threatening while looking for any opportunity to escape or defend herself. "General, please put the weapon down," she said. "This won't solve anything. It will only make things worse for you." The plea only seemed to enrage Hawthorne further. "Worse?" he screamed. "How could things be worse? They're going to strip me of my rank, destroy my reputation, end my career, all because of you and your lies." In that moment of blind rage and desperation, General Hawthorne made a decision that would seal his fate forever. His finger squeezed the trigger, and the first shot rang out across the medical tent. The bullet struck a medical cabinet behind Maria, sending supplies scattering as she dove for cover behind an examination table. The sound of gunfire on a military base immediately triggered security protocols. Guard posts throughout the facility reported the shots, and emergency response teams began mobilizing. However, the location of the gunfire meant that it would take several minutes for security personnel to reach the medical tent. Hawthorne fired again, this time aiming more deliberately at Maria's position behind the examination table. The bullet struck the table itself, sending splinters flying. Maria realized that her cover was inadequate and that she needed to find a better defensive position or attempt to escape. Using her knowledge of the medical tent's layout, Maria began moving toward the supply storage area where she hoped to find better cover or possibly a rear exit. Hawthorne, still firing wildly, sent a third shot that struck a IV stand, sending it crashing to the ground. "You can't hide from me," Hawthorne shouted, his voice becoming increasingly unhinged. "I'm going to finish this once and for all." He fired a fourth shot that came dangerously close to Maria as she scrambled toward the storage area. By this time, the commotion had attracted the attention of several soldiers in nearby facilities. Corporal Lisa Chen, who had been unable to sleep and was reviewing communications logs in the nearby radio tent, heard the gunfire and immediately realized that something terrible was happening at the medical facility where her friend was working alone. Lisa grabbed her radio and began transmitting emergency alerts while running toward the medical tent. Her calls for immediate backup and medical assistance went out across all military frequencies, ensuring that help would arrive as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, inside the medical tent, General Hawthorne was becoming more erratic and dangerous. The alcohol, combined with his psychological break, had made him completely unpredictable. He fired the fifth and final shot from his weapon just as Maria reached the storage area, the bullet striking a medical oxygen tank that fortunately didn't explode, but created a dangerous hissing sound as gas escaped. The sound of approaching boots and shouted commands from outside the tent seemed to snap Hawthorne back to some semblance of reality. He suddenly realized what he had done and what the consequences would be. The weapon fell from his hands as he stood among the destruction he had created, his career and life effectively over. Security personnel burst through the tent entrance with weapons drawn, finding General Hawthorne standing motionless among the scattered medical supplies and bullet holes. Maria emerged from the storage area, physically unharmed but clearly traumatized by the experience. The scene that greeted the security team was shocking even by military standards. A general officer had attempted to murder a subordinate with his service weapon, firing multiple shots in what could only be described as an assassination attempt. The implications for military discipline and command structure were staggering. Hawthorne was immediately disarmed and placed under arrest, though he offered no resistance. The reality of what he had done seemed to have penetrated his alcohol-clouded judgment, and he appeared to be in a state of shock at his own actions. Maria was quickly evacuated from the medical tent and taken to a secure location for her safety and to receive medical attention for shock and trauma. Lisa arrived just as her friend was being escorted to safety and was relieved to find that Maria had survived the attack physically unharmed. The news of the shooting spread rapidly throughout the base and beyond. Within hours, senior military officials from around the region were being briefed on the incident. The attempted murder of a female medic by her commanding general was unprecedented in modern military history. An immediate investigation was launched, not only into the shooting itself, but into the circumstances that had led to such a dramatic escalation. Maria's original harassment complaint, which had been moving slowly through official channels, suddenly became a high-priority case with implications for military leadership at all levels. The investigation team that arrived at the base the next morning included representatives from the Inspector General's office, Criminal Investigation Division agents, and senior officers from Regional Command. They found a base in shock, with soldiers struggling to understand how their commanding officer could have committed such an act. Initial interviews with base personnel revealed a pattern of behavior that painted a disturbing picture of General Hawthorne's leadership style and personal conduct. Several female soldiers came forward with their own accounts of inappropriate behavior, though none had faced the level of escalation that Maria had experienced. The investigation also uncovered evidence of other serious misconduct by Hawthorne and his inner circle of supporters. Financial irregularities in base operations, unauthorized use of military resources, and evidence of cover-ups involving previous incidents began to emerge as investigators dug deeper. What had started as a harassment complaint had evolved into an attempted murder case that was exposing systemic problems with military leadership and oversight. The shooting had blown open a Pandora's box of corruption and abuse that reached far beyond one base in Afghanistan. For Maria, the immediate aftermath of the shooting was a blur of interviews, medical examinations, and security briefings. She was praised for her courage in surviving the attack and for her earlier decision to file the harassment complaint that had triggered the investigation. However, the trauma of having 5 shots fired at her by someone in a position of ultimate authority was overwhelming. The psychological impact would take time to process, and Maria would need extensive support to recover from the experience. The military justice system moved quickly to process the case against Hawthorne. The evidence was overwhelming, with multiple witnesses to the shooting and clear physical evidence at the scene. His attempt to murder a subordinate was documented beyond any possible doubt. As word of the incident reached the media and civilian authorities, pressure mounted for a comprehensive investigation into how such a situation had been allowed to develop. Questions were raised about oversight of senior military officials and the effectiveness of systems designed to protect service members from abuse. The 5 shots that Hawthorne fired at Maria Rodriguez had missed their intended target, but they had struck at the heart of military institutional credibility. The investigation that would follow would expose levels of corruption and abuse that shocked even experienced military prosecutors. For Maria, survival was just the beginning. The real fight for justice was about to begin, and it would require her to display the same courage she had shown in the medical tent on that terrifying night. The bullets had missed, but the impact of those 5 shots would reverberate through the military establishment for years to come. The morning after the shooting brought an unprecedented level of activity to Forward Operating Base Thunder. Military investigators, legal officers, and senior command personnel descended on the remote Afghan outpost like a military operation itself. What they would uncover over the following weeks would shake the foundations of military leadership and expose a network of corruption that reached far beyond one rogue general. Maria Rodriguez found herself at the center of an investigation that had grown far beyond her original harassment complaint. Sequestered in a secure facility for her protection, she spent countless hours providing detailed testimony about not only the shooting, but every interaction she had experienced with General Hawthorne over the previous months. The investigation team was led by Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a respected military lawyer with decades of experience in complex cases involving senior officers. Mitchell had built her reputation on thorough, impartial investigations that followed evidence wherever it led, regardless of rank or political consequences. As investigators began examining Hawthorne's quarters and office, they discovered evidence that painted a disturbing picture of systematic abuse of power. Hidden cameras were found in areas where female soldiers frequently worked, including the medical facility where Maria had been assigned. Computer files contained inappropriate images and detailed surveillance logs of various female personnel on the base. The scope of Hawthorne's misconduct became clear as investigators uncovered what appeared to be a deliberate pattern of targeting female soldiers for harassment and worse. Several women came forward once they learned about the investigation, revealing incidents they had been too afraid to report previously. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, who had been transferred from the base 6 months earlier, provided testimony that Hawthorne had subjected her to similar harassment and had threatened her career when she resisted his advances. Her transfer, which had been processed as routine, was now revealed to be a way of silencing her complaints. Private First Class Angela Davis testified that Hawthorne had cornered her in a supply room and attempted to assault her physically. When she had reported the incident to her immediate supervisor, she was told that making accusations against the general would destroy her military career and that she should consider herself lucky to have a position at such an important facility. The pattern that emerged showed that Hawthorne had been using his position of authority to prey on female soldiers systematically. His behavior had escalated over time, becoming more brazen as he realized that the military hierarchy was protecting him from consequences. But the investigation revealed problems that went far beyond Hawthorne's personal conduct. Financial records showed that the general had been misappropriating military resources for personal use, including using base vehicles and personnel for private trips and converting military supplies for sale on the black market. Major James Patterson, Maria's immediate supervisor who had initially dismissed her harassment complaint, was found to have been receiving payments from Hawthorne in exchange for his silence and cooperation. Patterson had actively discouraged several women from filing complaints and had been instrumental in covering up Hawthorne's misconduct. The investigation also uncovered evidence that higher-ranking officials at Regional Command had been aware of problems at Base Thunder, but had chosen to ignore them because Hawthorne's unit had achieved impressive operational success in combat missions. His effectiveness in fighting Taliban forces had apparently made his superiors willing to overlook serious misconduct. Colonel Mitchell's team discovered that formal complaints about Hawthorne had been filed on 3 previous occasions over the past 2 years, but these complaints had been buried or dismissed without proper investigation. The military's own systems for protecting service members from abuse had failed catastrophically. As the investigation expanded, it became clear that Hawthorne had not been acting alone. Several members of his inner circle of officers had been aware of his behavior and had actively participated in covering it up. Some had even facilitated his access to female soldiers by arranging duty assignments and scheduling. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Reed, Hawthorne's second-in-command, was found to have falsified reports about the transfer of female soldiers who had complained about the general. He had also intimidated witnesses and destroyed evidence of Hawthorne's misconduct on multiple occasions. The investigation revealed that a culture of fear and intimidation had developed on the base, where questioning Hawthorne's authority was seen as career suicide. Junior officers and enlisted personnel had learned to stay silent about problems they witnessed, knowing that speaking out would result in retaliation. Maria's decision to file a formal complaint had been extraordinarily brave given this environment. Investigators found that she was the first person to document Hawthorne's behavior thoroughly and follow through with official channels despite the obvious risks to her safety and career. The media coverage of the case began to intensify as details of the investigation leaked to reporters. The story of a female medic being shot at by her commanding general captured public attention and raised serious questions about military culture and leadership accountability. Congressional representatives began demanding answers about how such a situation had been allowed to develop. Military officials found themselves testifying before committees about systemic failures in oversight and protection of female service members. The investigation also revealed that Hawthorne's problems with alcohol and psychological instability had been known to his superiors for months before the shooting. Medical records showed that he had been experiencing increasing stress and had been drinking heavily, yet no action had been taken to address these issues or remove him from command. As the case proceeded through the military justice system, Hawthorne's defense team attempted to portray the shooting as the result of a psychological breakdown caused by combat stress. However, the evidence of premeditated harassment and systematic abuse made it clear that his actions were part of a pattern of deliberate misconduct rather than a momentary lapse in judgment. The prosecution, led by military attorneys with extensive experience in high-profile cases, presented a comprehensive case showing that Hawthorne had abused his position of authority to prey on subordinates for months. The attempted murder of Maria Rodriguez was presented as the logical escalation of increasingly desperate attempts to silence his victims. Witness testimony during the court-martial proceedings revealed the full extent of the toxic culture that had developed under Hawthorne's leadership. Soldiers described an environment where female personnel lived in constant fear, where complaints were routinely ignored, and where loyalty to the general was valued above basic human decency. Maria's testimony was particularly powerful, as she described not only the shooting itself, but the months of escalating harassment that had preceded it. Her detailed documentation of incidents and her courage in pursuing formal complaints despite obvious dangers painted a picture of extraordinary bravery in the face of systematic abuse. The defense's attempts to discredit Maria's testimony failed completely when presented with the overwhelming evidence of Hawthorne's pattern of behavior. The physical evidence from the shooting scene, combined with testimony from multiple witnesses, made denial impossible. During the trial, it was also revealed that Hawthorne had been under investigation by federal authorities for his involvement in illegal weapons trafficking. He had been using his position to facilitate the sale of military equipment to private contractors, generating substantial personal profits while weakening base security. The weapons trafficking charges added another dimension to the case, showing that Hawthorne's corruption had extended far beyond personal misconduct to include serious crimes against national security. His network of accomplices included civilians and military personnel across multiple bases and countries. As the investigation continued to expand, authorities uncovered evidence of similar problems at other military facilities where Hawthorne had previously served. His pattern of abuse and corruption appeared to have followed him throughout his career, suggesting that institutional failures in military oversight were widespread. The court-martial proceedings lasted several weeks and received extensive media coverage. The case became a symbol of the need for reform in military culture and accountability systems. Advocacy groups for military sexual assault victims rallied around Maria's case as an example of why systematic changes were needed. When the verdict was finally announced, Hawthorne was found guilty on all charges including attempted murder, sexual harassment, abuse of authority, fraud, and weapons trafficking. The sentence included life in prison without possibility of parole, forfeiture of all military benefits, and discharge with dishonor. Several of his accomplices, including Major Patterson and Lieutenant Colonel Reed, also received significant prison sentences and dishonorable discharges. The investigation had successfully dismantled the entire network of corruption and abuse that had operated under Hawthorne's leadership. For Maria Rodriguez, the conclusion of the trial marked the end of a traumatic ordeal, but also the beginning of a new chapter in her life. Her courage in standing up to powerful figures who seemed untouchable had not only brought them to justice, but had sparked important conversations about military culture and accountability. The military implemented significant reforms in response to the case, including new oversight mechanisms for senior officers, improved reporting systems for harassment and abuse, and mandatory training programs addressing sexual assault and retaliation. Maria's case became a catalyst for positive change throughout the military establishment. Maria received numerous commendations for her bravery, including medals for her service in Afghanistan and recognition for her role in exposing corruption and abuse. However, she chose to leave active military service to pursue a career in civilian medicine, feeling that she had already given enough to her country. The investigation that began with 5 shots fired in anger had ultimately exposed a network of corruption and abuse that reached across multiple military installations and involved dozens of personnel. The systematic failures that had allowed Hawthorne to operate with impunity for years were addressed through comprehensive reforms. Years later, Maria would reflect on that terrifying night in the medical tent as a turning point not just in her own life, but in military culture itself. The 5 shots that were meant to silence her had instead given voice to countless other victims and had created lasting change in how the military protects its most vulnerable members. The case of General Richard Hawthorne became a landmark in military justice, studied in law schools and military academies as an example of how institutional failures can enable individual corruption and abuse. More importantly, it demonstrated that even the most powerful figures can be held accountable when brave individuals are willing to stand up for what is right. Maria Rodriguez had survived an attempted murder and had seen justice served, but perhaps her greatest achievement was the knowledge that her courage had made the military a safer place for all the female service members who would follow in her footsteps. The investigation that exposed the arrogant general had ultimately strengthened the institution they had both sworn to serve.